welcome to the Genre Fiction Podcast. We have a special guest tonight. As always, our special guest tonight is Khaiah Thompson, who's coming to us from Perth. So Khaiah is an author. She's the author of the Welcome to Blackwood young adult paranormal fiction series. The first book in the series, titled Welcome to Blackwood, won the Hawkeye Publishing Manuscript Development Prize in 2020. Khaiah was a finalist in the Qld Writers Centre ADAPTABLE competition. Book 2 in a series, Leaving Blackwood, has been released, with Book 3, Redeeming Blackwood, currently in production. And Khaiah also runs workshops in relation to driving, using conflict to drive plot. And we're going to be talking about some of the aspects of those workshops relating to heroes and villains and so on. So we're going to flesh it out in more detail. But first of all, Khaiah, g'day and welcome to our little podcast.
Hi, firstly, thank you for having me. And secondly, well done for getting my name right. It's a bit of a tricky one if you look at it on paper.
It is. I did spend a bit of time going, how the hell do I pronounce that? But yeah. At least I now know.
Yeah, I figured you'd let me know if you got it wrong. So let's launch straight in, Khaiah. So just to get us underway, so you're an author and you've published your first, so I'm correct in that you've published the first 2 books in your 3-book series, which is a young adult paranormal fiction series.
Yep.
Tell us, how did you first get into writing at all, generally, and then how did what made you decide to focus on that particular genre?
Yeah, so I hadn't done a lot of creative writing up until I wrote Welcome to Blackwood. So for me, in a professional aspect, I'd done a lot of writing, government work. You can imagine the kind of stuff I was writing, very boring. So when I had my first son, I found myself, when he was about 1, with a bit of spare time. And I read a lot of fiction, a lot of fantasy, a lot of urban fantasy, a lot of young adult fiction. So because that's my comfort, my area of comfort, I think my comfort reading sort of genre. Yeah, when I'd reached this point that I had a fair bit of spare time, I thought, why not give writing a book a go? And yeah, so that's when Welcome to Blackwood was born. And I picked urban fantasy because for me, I think writing something new, or because I was new to creative writing, being able to draw on my own environment was really helpful for like world building and developing those kind of scenes.
Mm-hmm. And when you write, or say when you first started writing your first book, were you imagining a YA audience, or as you say, you're writing because it's the genre that you enjoy reading? So did you have a particular audience in mind, thinking this will appeal to adults like me who like this sort of these sort of stories, or was there a deliberate intention to direct your story at the younger target audience?
I was really writing it for myself. So I was writing what I wanted to read. I did, mind you, in the background, I think as I sort of got towards the end of writing the first book, I did have a target audience in mind. You know, when I look back, those sort of teenage years, what I was reading at the time, like that was just a very important time of my life. So I think I was a bit more mindful of what I was writing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How long did it take you to write your first go, your first draft?
First draft was about 6 months, I think.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. How many words? What was the word count?
Initially, it was 120.
Wow.
And then I cut it down to just below 100,000 because that was, I think, the cutoff for the Hawkeye prize.
Yeah.
And then I further culled another 20,000 words from that.
Geez, that must have been tough.
It was pretty tough, but it made me a better writer, that's for sure.
And when you wrote that first book and you submitted into the manuscript competition, which you eventually won and kind of launched your publishing journey from there, did you already have book 2 and book 3 in mind? Did you already know that it was part of a 3-book series?
No, I'm very much a pantser. I sort of had like a bit of a, and when I say pantser, for those who don't know what it is, like I just read up. I write, yeah, just off the seat of my pants. I just sit down and write and let the ideas flow. So I had the idea for the first book, and then I I had the beginning, I had the middle, I had the end. And then I got to the end and it hadn't really finished. So I thought, oh, I can keep going with this. And so it kept going.
Okay, great. And when did you embark on the second book? I mean, was it after your first book was published, then you started seriously thinking about, okay, look, there's scope here for a second book, or was it already in the works well before then, the second book?
Yeah. Hindsight is a great thing. So I'd published the first book, and then my editor sort of came to me a couple of months later, and she's like, "Oh, so how's it going with the second book?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, it's coming along." And I hadn't started it. I was like, "Oh, I better sit down and actually start this thing." So yeah, I think looking back, I wished I'd have maybe started writing that second one just to give me a bit more time. Like, I know as a reader, I like books to come out 12 months apart if they're a series. So I had that expectation of myself, and then it hasn't really happened with the third book, but anyway.
And so where's book 3 at the moment? What's its status?
It's due for release in July, August. Yeah.
Okay. And on no spoilers, but does it wrap up the series, or is there scope for more?
It does wrap up the series, but it does leave scope for more.
Okay. All right. Never say never.
Hard to end it.
And was it the first book that you were a finalist for Adaptable?
Yes. Yeah. That's all. Yeah. So welcome.
Did you get any takers?
Yeah, there was a couple. One of them is still actually no, and one of the ones I had thought weren't interested have come back with a bit of interest. But there's one that's sort of keeping an eye on the whole series. I think they want to see how it all pans out. So yeah, maybe we'll see.
What year was that?
2021.
Right. Okay.
That's been a while, 3 years.
I had I was a finalist for the 2020, but it was the awkward year where COVID hit and everyone didn't know how to use Zoom, and it was a bit of a mess. But I believe another person here is currently in the long list at the moment.
Oh, great.
Yeah, we'll see how that pans out. And look, for anyone who's wondering what we're talking about so the Adaptable program, which is possible conversion of manuscripts to screenplays for pitching to production companies for conversion to screen. Would that be a fair way of summarizing?
Fair enough. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so Khaiah, let's jump in and talk about so you've launched your writing career as an author. Book 2's out, book 3 is on its way, and you've started delivering these workshops. So just as a bit of a summary as to the workshops that you're delivering. So the workshops are about the importance of conflict in driving the plot of a story. It explores character developments of the protagonist, the hero or the anti-hero, and we're going to talk about what that means a bit later, and the antagonist, the villain or the anti-villain, and the progressive change in writing or reading trends from your typical hero versus villain story to different shades of morally grey. So this we're going to start taking a bit of a deep dive into what are some of the key takeaways of what you talk about in your workshop. So tell us just really quickly, how did it come about that you started started delivering these workshops?
Yeah. So again, because my target audience is like your young adults, your teenagers, I've always very much loved my local library. So getting it, I wanted to get involved if I could, and with that age group. And the idea of anti-villains and anti-heroes really fascinates me. So I thought if I could do a workshop around that, at least it's something I enjoy. So I can quite happily talk about it for hours. Yeah.
Right.
So and what's the definition of an anti-villain and an anti-hero?
Oh, they just... look, I do have it all written down somewhere. But essentially they're blurring the lines between good and evil. So you have a hero that isn't, morally perfect, and then you might have a villain that has some, redeeming traits, that kind of thing. Yeah.
I've actually got one that I prepared early because I had the same question, and I thought I'll do a bit of Googling.
You looked it up. Yeah, you did. You did research prior to it.
Mainly so I could pretend I was intelligent, but I'm not going to admit to that. So pretty much what you just said. So an anti-hero is a main character in a narrative who may lack conventional heroic qualities and attributes such as idealism, courage, and morality. That is, their actions are morally ambiguous. So I'm thinking, sometimes you could have a protagonist or a hero, inverted commas, who's either a very reluctant hero or they're an accidental hero. In circumstances, they become a hero due to circumstances, not because they're this, they're this upright, morally strong person. They just find themselves in circumstances. And I kind of picture someone like, Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry. He's a police officer with really questionable morals. He's prepared to do the bad things for the overall good, to catch the bad guys. And that's why I think people love Dirty Harry, because he's a copper who's breaking the rules all the time. He's not your classic, hero. He's a bit of a bad man, but he's catching the bad criminals. And I think that's where everyone loves him.
Yeah.
Did you carry around a Magnum?
No. And I never said, go ahead, punk. Make my day. Never had the opportunity. It just never presented itself. But
I think I probably have in my line of work, but anyway, that's another story.
So that's anti-hero. Actually, another one that just comes to mind, we talk about traditionally your heroes versus your villains. You got your good versus evil. Batman versus the Joker. Superman versus the evil, characters that he versus, good versus evil. But the new Joker movie with Joaquin Phoenix, where the way the Joker's character is portrayed is so much different. We actually get to learn more about him as a person and get to understand, even though we know he's going to go on to be this villain, he's got his own backstory that kind of allows us to sort of empathize with him and like him and understand how he came to be that person.
Yeah. Yeah. I always think, like, in recent times, you look at a great example, Walter White from Breaking Bad. I mean, Breaking Bad came out at that perfect point, just in the middle of the financial crisis, or as we were coming out the other end of it. And everybody could relate to this man and why he was doing all these terrible things, because we'd all experienced it to some degree.
Yeah, I think that's if anyone ever asks what's a character arc, that's a perfect example, is Breaking Bad, where he goes from this sort of like stuttering, sort of mild, meek teacher into a badass sort of drug baron. And you've got that whole sort of transition is fantastic. And was it 7 seasons?
Oh, something like that. Yeah. It's been a while since I watched them.
Now, there's the flip side of it, which is the anti-villain. Can I put you on the spot, Khaiah, and what's your take on what, if we, again, talking about explaining what does that term mean? Anti-villain.
I think, like, when you have a villain that's a character who's doing terrible things, but for the greater good or for a good purpose, like, they might have good morals underneath that. They're just going about it the wrong way, right? You look at Thanos, for example. I love the Avengers universe, all of that. Thanos, he wanted to halve the world's population or the universe's population, because it wasn't sustainable. Like, he was doing it for the greater good. Like, in a way, I mean, we still don't like him, but in a way, he's an anti-villain, if you look at that.
Yeah, and they talk about the different, the sliding scale of evil, going back to the cliche good versus evil. And you have these villains who are they're just evil people, inherently evil. Oftentimes they're just portrayed as, these bad characters, and we don't really get an insight as to what caused them to be so evil. It's just part of their human nature. But then I suppose when we start talking around this topic of the morally grey, they talk about the scale of evil, that some of these villains have an element of good about them. So what is it that's motivating them to do certain things? As we talked about, it's that the greater good.
Yeah.
I was actually just in terms of my other research with this, talking about the different types of villains. Probably what we talked about, there's the well-meaning, like, extremist.
Yeah.
That they believe that they're justified.
Well-meaning extremist. That sounds a little bit sort of oxymoronic.
Yeah, they're kind of justified in taking extreme. You know, they're willing to kill a lot of bad people if it means saving the world. You know, so they can justify taking some. And you might have two, you know, your villain and your hero that have actually got their views are very close, but they're willing to do certain. You know, what they're prepared to do might be a little bit different, but they might even actually hold similar beliefs. Anyway, look, I don't want to steal your thunder, Kai, because you're here to tell us all about all this stuff. So I guess
he's done his research and he wants to tell everybody.
I want you to know how smart I am. So we've got a bit of an idea of what are we talking about in terms of anti-villain, anti-heroes, and we can delve into that in more detail. But I'll pose the first question to you, Kai, is what's more important to a story, your protagonist or your antagonist?
Oh, look, I don't think you can have one without the other. It's like yin and yang. You need both to build a good story. I mean, you wouldn't have the Avengers if there was no one to avenge. So if there was no villain, you wouldn't have a hero. You wouldn't need one. So really both I think are just as important. And I think where it can get difficult is making your readers like the protagonist more than the villain, especially when you're looking at anti-heroes and anti-villains.
Yeah. And are you seeing a shift in modern stories where, you know, previously, say, Superman, Batman, pick your hero or heroine, they're the lead in the story. And everything's about them, and they're vanquishing the evil characters. But what we're now starting to see is a real shift towards telling the story of the villain, and they're almost seen as an equal. And yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it is. Again, that line is really getting blurred. I mean, personally, I still like to have, you know, your villain's just a bad villain. So they tend to be the stories that I read. I guess they're looking at, you know, I think what's the series called on Netflix? And it's all about that sort of emotional toing and froing. You don't know, you know, you think this person's the good guy in the beginning, and then at the end they might be the bad guy, and it leaves you emotionally conflicted because you're not sure who you should be supporting. Like,
have you watched The Gentleman?
Sorry?
Have you watched The Gentleman?
Oh, I loved it. I loved how that ended. I don't want to give anything away, but I knew what was coming, and I loved it. Yeah.
Well, it's like this is a major spoiler, but I'm sure people have seen the Hunger Games by now, but almost one of the very final scenes after those series of movies, based off the books, of course, is where Katniss has her bow and arrow, and instead of shooting what's his name? President Snow.
Yeah.
She shoots
Sunderland.
Yes, who's going to die anyway because he's always bleeding into his handkerchief. But she shoots the woman who's emerging as the new leader, who is being portrayed throughout the whole series as this new charismatic leader who's going to direct them into a world of good and prosperity. But then Katniss realizes that she's probably more evil than President Snow, and she's going to reintroduce the Hunger Games, and she's going to take them back into the dark old times. And it's that sudden shift right at the very end that, as you're just saying, Kai, that hang on, this person who we thought was being pitched as the good person has got evil intentions as well. And, you know, in the real world, that probably, I don't know, is there such a thing as good and evil? And, you know, do we all carry those sort of traits?
Yeah, well, that's it, isn't it? That's how we relate to those characters, because all of us are flawed to some degree. So, you know, I look at, because I read a lot of, again, young adult fiction and romance, and this obsession with the morally grey love interest. Like, it's really interesting. It's really taken off in the last decade or so. And it's, you know, it's, I guess, looking at flaws that we can, or these people have flaws, these protagonists, the love interests have flaws that we can relate to, even if they are in the extreme. It's just, I'm not sure what it's like in the genres that you guys read and that you write, but it's, definitely taken off big time in young adult fiction.
Is the sort of more commonly seen these days, the backstory happening with the villain, all that sort of stuff, is that though perhaps more of a result of stories being retold in a different way, and therefore, you know, like the Joker, you can't just do another Batman movie. You've got to do something different this time. And what we're going to do? Well, let's get some backstory to this guy, or, you know, sort of one of the henchmen who usually just dies in 5 minutes into the movie. Let's give him a bit of a backstory because it'll give it a different twist. Is it just simply a case that a lot of the time movies are being made because they're using sort of like well-known stories that they can rehash and they know they're going to sell?
Yeah, I guess so. Like, seeing that different side of characters that we've not seen before. I mean, you look at part of the purpose of conflict in storytelling is seeing characters' flaws and helping us to get to know them and see how it sort of shapes them throughout the story. And then if you have this new take where you get to know characters you might not have known so well, like you said, you know, you get to know them more, you get to see their motivations for what they're doing, and then you find yourself liking them. And I think you're right in that sense.
And I think maybe readers and audiences are starting to want more from a story. You know, I think that the naive notion that, you know, there's true good versus true evil and good always endures. I think people are starting to kind of realize, well, look, you know, human nature is that all of us can be good and all of us can be bad, depending on how far we're pushed. And I think that's what we're starting to see now, is with writers in particular and screenwriters. They're trying to add extra layers to all these characters and villains. And so, as you say, Kai, so that it's not just a case of we love the hero, we hate the villain. Maybe, like, I like the example of, you know, have you seen the Dexter series? It's based off some books, but basically he's a forensics officer that works for a police department. I think it's in Miami. But he's a murderer. But he's got a very strict moral code in that he only kills bad people. And, you know, so you can't help but love Dexter because he's always trying to outdo, he's always got to try and be one step ahead of this detective who's onto him and is trying to catch him out. And so he's always trying to be one step ahead and not get caught. But the reason why we love Dexter is because he's got these scruples and he's always got this internal battle around, you know, and he does some pretty horrific things. Like, he's a cold-blooded killer, but he's only killing bad people. So I think, I mean, put up your hand, how many of us here have actually fantasized about being a vigilante and just killing bad people? You know, I think those kind of baddies kind of appeal to our human nature.
Yeah. And I think it's also part of that, you know, the escapism around reading or watching something where we admire those characters for doing it and we like it in a story, but maybe we wouldn't like it so much in real life. But it's that, you know, they can push those boundaries that we can't, or that we wouldn't.
Yeah. And I really like I think we kind of touched on this earlier. I really like those stories where the person who initially is pitched as the bad guy, could be like a really, you know, tormenting stepfather, or someone who's the bully, or you know, they're kind of pitched as the one that's harassing the protagonist. But in the end, they become the salvation. They become the one that saves the day, and the person that we think is the gold-toothed hero is the one pulling the strings. And I think it's about manipulating readers and red herrings and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, you touched on it before. My next question, and delving more into some of the stuff that you talk about in your workshops, you talked about the importance of conflict driving a story and developing characters. So can you tell us a bit more about that in terms of using conflict, and what are some of the key points that you talk about in your workshop?
So just around conflict, in the workshops I really use it. So I do a bit of an activity with kids where they develop a protagonist and then or the villain, and it can go one way or the other. It depends who they want to develop first. You know, some of the boys in particular tend to like the villains, so they want to, you know, develop that character first, and then a protagonist who creates that conflict. So once you've got those sort of two opposing sides, and sometimes again there are those lines that blur, but when you have that conflict, it helps to drive the story. It helps you to create the scenes and helps the characters in a way to create themselves. Like conflict, it develops the characters. It shows what their flaws are, what their strengths are, and how they can change and grow throughout your story. Like you need that conflict there. That's what, without it, it would be very boring, and you wouldn't be able to hook readers. Like you need to keep it hooked.
I'm interested that you've got these sort of like, you're doing these workshops and teaching people how to sort of like think about your characters and things like that. But how does that work as a pantser? Because often you don't spend that time developing characters, you just start writing. And
No,
it's
well,
fine.
it
And then I'll go,
still
cool,
works.
that's a really good character. And then I'll just carry on going, you know.
Yeah.
How do you teach that?
Oh, yeah. So that is actually something I had to go back and think about when I was developing this workshop, because I think it's something that I naturally do. I have it sitting up here in my head somewhere. Like, and there is a backstory. I don't know, you know, I haven't thought about it, but there is a backstory there to why my characters are the way they are.
Yeah.
And I think it helps having worked like with a lot of people, like, you know, going through conflict or going through stressful situations, and people just, you know, react so differently, and they grow so differently, and they manage conflict so differently, that I have quite a store of different types of characters in my head that I can pull on. So yeah, when I started writing Welcome to Blackwood, I mean, I started with the protagonist, so with Freya, who's the main character, and I had a bit of an idea of who she was. But yeah, she did really develop throughout the story, and it was the conflict that helped to, that development. Like even with dialogue, when, you know, she, there's a scene where she and the villain first meet, and it's when I had to think about, okay, so he says this, how would she respond to that? Then I had to start coming up with a bit of a backstory for that character. Like, okay, let's think about who she is. So I was still a pantster, but yeah.
Yeah. Developing characters on the fly.
Yeah, that's it.